The first sound was her laughter. It wasn't the soft, playful chuckle he remembered from their early days. It was sharp, brittle, a brittle shard of glass cutting through the calm of their Sunday morning. He froze in the doorway, shirt half tucked, the coffee cup he'd just poured trembling in his hands. You're you're joking, he said, voice wavering, though he barely recognized it as his own. Her laughter only grew, curling around the edges of the silence he'd tried to hold on to, wrapping it in a cold, deliberate warmth that made his chest ache. No, she said, calm now, deliberate. I'm not joking. You really thought. She let it hang. He felt the words slam against him like a winter wind he hadn't seen coming. You never expected cruelty from someone you loved, he thought, and the truth was almost unbearable in its simplicity. How long? He managed, his voice breaking. Long enough to know I deserved better than your oblivion, she said. Her eyes didn't waver, and for a moment he wanted her to flinch, to falter, anything that would humanize her guilt. But she didn't. She was too composed. He stumbled back into the hallway, leaning against the wall. His mind raced, trying to place the fractures in their life, the tiny fissures he'd ignored, the nights he'd been too busy, too distracted, too himself to see what was happening behind the curtain of their home. I don't understand, he whispered. His throat was tight, the words catching. You, we, she shook her head, a half smile on her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Understanding isn't the point. I wanted to feel alive again. And you were asleep. In every sense that mattered. The room felt suddenly small, claustrophobic, the walls closing in. He wanted to yell, to cry, to demand answers, but the words stuck in his throat, as if shame itself had weight enough to silence him. Her laughter returned, quieter this time, more insidious. You look exactly how I imagined you'd look, she said. The man who thought love was enough. The man who doesn't even realize how little it mattered to me. He didn't speak. He couldn't. All he could do was stare, a hollow, disbelief-stricken witness to the life he thought he knew. Later that evening, after she'd left for a week-long retreat she insisted she needed, he sat on the edge of their bed, staring at the rumpled sheets that smelled faintly of her perfume. The betrayal had a texture to it, a physical presence that pressed down on him. He went through the motions of trying to sleep, but his thoughts were merciless. The humiliation wasn't public, not yet, but it cut deeper for being intimate. No one else needed to know. He had already witnessed the private cruelty. Every memory of her kindness now bore a shadow, every whispered endearment tinged with mockery in retrospect. He felt like a man looking through cracked glass at his own reflection, unable to recognize the person staring back. The next morning, he went to work, but the office felt alien. Every conversation with colleagues was filtered through a haze of inadequacy. He imagined their eyes tracing him, seeing the invisible mark of betrayal smeared across his forehead. He remembered the way she had leaned into another man's shoulder at the gallery opening last month, the subtle closeness he had rationalized as harmless. It wasn't harmless. It had never been harmless. He tried talking to a friend over lunch, fumbling over the words, each one tasting wrong, like a lie he couldn't swallow. I think she's been seeing someone else, he said finally, voice low, almost ashamed to say it aloud. His friend's brow furrowed. How long? I don't know, he admitted. I just found out yesterday. There was a silence after that, one that didn't comfort him. Instead, it reflected his own confusion. How could someone he loved so completely, someone he had believed shared the same life and values, be capable of this? The self-doubt spiraled. Was he blind, naive, unworthy of her loyalty? Back at his apartment that night, he stared at his reflection in the window, the city lights dancing over his face. The question he couldn't stop asking himself was simple, terrifying. Was I ever really loved? Or was it just an illusion? A story I told myself to keep living comfortably. By the fourth day, the raw edge of anger had begun to fade, replaced by something sharper, quieter, clarity. He replayed the moments in his mind, not to agonize, but to see them for what they were. The late-night texts he had ignored, the distant conversations that once seemed trivial, the subtle ways she had created space between them. He realized that the betrayal wasn't just the affair, It was the months of neglect that made it possible. He began journaling at night, scribbling observations, confessions, emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Writing was a salve, a way to untangle the knotted threads of hurt, humiliation, and disappointment. He realized he didn't have to forgive her, but he did have to reclaim himself. And somewhere, in the quiet of that reclamation, he felt the first stirrings of dignity. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady and deliberate. The first social confrontation came unexpectedly at a dinner party hosted by a mutual friend. He had debated not going, but part of him wanted to see her, to measure the distance between them, to feel the truth in the space she had claimed for herself. She was there, laughing lightly at some shared joke with another man. That same man she had whispered about in veiled terms. That same man whose presence now felt like a knife pressed against the ribs of his memory. When she saw him, her smile was courteous, almost practiced, but it didn't reach her eyes. She leaned toward her companion, brushing past him, and for a moment he considered leaving, slipping out quietly to spare himself the humiliation. But he stayed. The night was a series of invisible stings. Casual comments, once innocent, now felt loaded. "You two should travel more," someone said, nodding at them. She laughed a little too easily, and the man beside her smiled in a way that made his stomach twist. He caught fragments of conversations, playful teasing, inside jokes he didn't belong to, glances that spoke of intimacy he had never been part of. He forced himself to smile, nod, sip his wine. Each gesture was a mask, each polite laugh a measured shield. And beneath it all, the self-doubt whispered, "How could I have been so blind? Was I ever truly part of her life, or just a placeholder until something better came along?" Returning home, he didn't sleep. He paced, replaying every interaction, every nuance, every moment he might have misread. The loneliness was no longer just physical, it was an intimate kind of isolation, the kind that erodes confidence from the inside. He began looking at himself differently. In the mirror, he saw the man who had tolerated small cruelties, who had excused absences, who had normalized distance. He saw not just the lover who had been betrayed, but the version of himself who had let it happen. And yet, there was a flicker. Amid the despair, he realized that self-doubt, while consuming, could also teach him something. He didn't have to shrink into the shadow of her betrayal. He could confront it, accept it, and choose a path that was his own. The clarity came slowly. He began setting boundaries he had ignored before, turning off notifications, avoiding places he knew she would frequent, even declining invitations that might force another confrontation. Each small act of self-preservation felt revolutionary, a reclaiming of space he hadn't known was his to reclaim. Weeks passed. He stopped expecting apologies, explanations, or validation. The need for her recognition, once a burning obsession, began to cool. He started volunteering, attending evening classes, picking up books he had ignored for years. The world outside their fractured relationship was still vast, still waiting. And slowly he remembered that he had a life of his own. One evening, walking through a quiet park, he realized he hadn't thought about her betrayal in hours. It wasn't gone. He knew it would never entirely disappear. But it had lost its power to define him. He stopped at a bench, watched the lights glimmer on the lake, and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Calm. He didn't need vindication. He didn't need revenge. He simply needed himself. And in that quiet moment, he understood something essential. Dignity is not loud. It is not demonstrated by confrontation or punishment. It is the steady, unshakable choice to live fully, to honor one's own worth, even when the world, or someone you love, has tried to convince you otherwise. The message came one evening long after the sting of betrayal had dulled to a familiar ache. It was brief, almost casual, and yet it carried the weight of everything they had once shared. "Can we talk?" He stared at the screen, thumb hovering. Part of him wanted to delete it, to block her entirely, to protect the fragile peace he had built. But another part, the old unhealed part, wanted to know why. He typed back simply, "I don't think that's necessary." The words felt heavier than he expected, but they were right. He didn't need an explanation. He didn't need apologies. He didn't need to see the traces of guilt that might soften her edges for him. When she called, he let it ring once, then silence. That one choice, small and deliberate, carried more weight than months of arguments, tears, or confrontations ever could. He had learned something profound. Closure doesn't always come from the other person, it comes from yourself. Weeks later, he attended an art exhibit, wandering past canvases that caught light in unexpected ways. A group of strangers laughed nearby, and for a moment he allowed himself to lean into it, to feel the pulse of life continuing around him. He ran into an old friend, someone who hadn't known about the affair. They talked about mundane things at first: books, travel, the weather. But gradually the conversation deepened. He felt the old warmth of connection, uncomplicated by judgment or past mistakes. It struck him then how much he had carried, how much weight he had placed on someone else's choices. And now, for the first time in months, he felt a quiet liberation. His world wasn't smaller. It had only begun to expand again. Back at home that night, he stood in front of the mirror. His eyes were tired, yes, but also calm. His reflection no longer held the hollow shock of betrayal. It held someone who had endured, observed, and ultimately chosen himself. He touched the glass lightly, a silent promise. The past had happened, but it did not define him. He would live fully, not to prove her wrong, not to reclaim a love that was gone, but because he deserved it. In the quiet of his apartment, he finally smiled, not the tight, nervous smile of a man seeking reassurance, but the slow, deep smile of someone who had learned that dignity is not loud or performative. It is quiet, steadfast, and unwavering. And for the first time in a long time, he felt whole.